I'm going to try and do this one without leaning my head to the side the whole time. We'll see if it works. I feel like a pet rabbit we used to have that got a disease and their head was always laying over on one side. Okay, too much information. So the last three places I worked, we built, and it's been frustrating and useful depending on how the company implemented it. We built our own control plane to manage our move to the cloud. And all of them started with moving to the cloud and then realized they wanted their own control plane. And the reason we did that at every place was we wanted a repeatable process. We needed to implement standards to try and make things look similar to each other inside the company where possible. And we needed traceability, and we wanted linkages to our data governance, data management, data governance, right? And the cloud control planes don't really care about any of that. And if you're working for a 4-person startup, none of this applies. You're just banging on stuff, trying to get it done. And when you get past that phase, suddenly it matters, right? All this other stuff matters. So these are, what I'm talking about is self-created public cloud control planes. So it's created by your company, which is a ton of work. It's crazy expensive. Oh, I probably didn't even put that on the list. I'll put it in the slide later. And this is basically acts as a proxy for the vendor control plane. All right. And by control plane, I mean all those provisioning endpoints in the portal. And if you're doing your cloud deployments in the portal, don't leave a comment, because that is totally the wrong thing to be doing. All right. And then what we do is we build these proxies, these kind of like website or API things in front of it. And it manages the company's cloud resources. It categorizes those resources and tags them and does all kinds of stuff so we can report against them later. And this self-created portal basically distributes commands to the cloud provider services and to their endpoints and to third parties, including SaaS providers. And it will log the control plane activity. So every time you're going to go do something, it'll go to one place. Because if you look at the way the cloud vendors are done, they implement 100 services, and each of those services sends their logs to somewhere else, or it's slightly different. That's why they move so fast, because they don't worry about coordinating all that stuff. And so this self-created control plane enforces standards across applications and teams, and it provides a place for central reporting. And so how do we get into this? Well, it turns out when you move into the cloud, this is Azure, AWS, but Azure's kind of got the same list size thing here. You have massive flexibility, and the tools are easily available. And that means you want to use them. That's why you move into the cloud. You can have dozens of services, hundreds of services. They cross all disciplines: data, compute, AI, everything. You have access to unlimited data, which you didn't have before. And you can scale up and scale down. You can scale out. You can, there's crazy stuff. You can do cross-region, cross-world, right? You have reduced experimental costs. It's pretty cool, all right? And, it's the usual: with great flexibility comes great power, comes great responsibility, right? And so the real promise of this is that you can have any capability at any time. It is the democratization of access to capabilities, right? When you first play in the cloud, any team can provision any service. And they can talk to cloud services and provision their stuff too, right? They pull in third-party libraries, third-party components, and deploy them in the cloud. It's amazing. And then you realize you may not want everybody running every service, right? Like some of those services aren't secure yet in the ways you want. They don't implement encryption. They have side effects, right? And so, or the licenses are wrong or whatever, right? So, but the great promise of this is that you can do this anytime. And you know what? That creates its own issues. So what ends up happening is companies end up creating their own control plane. Really, we're talking about infrastructure storage, access management, governance, those kinds of things. So what ends up happening, and I added more here, right? You have a bunch of teams. They actually proxy through the enterprise control plane. That control plane sits in front of the cloud control plane and talks to all the cloud services. And then if you have a SaaS service you're providing that isn't native, like a data warehouse, it's cloud native, but it's not native to the control plane, then your enterprise control plane will sit in front of that too, right? So now you have a single API for both the cloud services and your third-party services. And then when you have governance and controls that you need to implement, like data catalog, data governance catalog, data sensitivity, access controls for data, this enterprise control plane will actually cover for that, right? So it's also a proxy for your data catalog, your artifact catalog, your approval system, maybe. But basically, the idea is you build a wrapper. Companies will build, and this is a lot of work. One place I worked, we had 4 development teams doing nothing but the control plane. And I should call that out. It's expensive too. And so this is what we're talking about. In the end, if you end up in, and you're going to apply any governance, you're in any regulated industry or any financial, you're going to end up probably building your own control plane in front of the cloud provider and the third-party products and in front of your data governance. All right. So how did we get into that, where we're going to do that? I made all those statements. So democratization is great. Everything is possible. You can do rapid prototyping. You build it, you own it, right? Like I built it, it's mine. And it's empowering that way. You can lower your fixed costs because you're like, I'm trying this and I tore it down. I tried it and I tore it down. You break the SME admin bottleneck at a lot of companies. If you picked a database, and I'm looking at you, the big O, you tend to get choked around the people that run those systems, right? When you move into the cloud, man, anybody can set up their database. Maybe not as well, but they don't have to worry about running it anymore. It's really dialed down to the schema part. In this, you can do any kind of volume you want. I want to make a copy of the data and make it a couple hundred terabytes. I worked a couple places. We had over 20 to 50 petabytes of data. That wasn't even possible. And I can just go play with that and see how it's going to work. And I always can run the latest versions. If you're not in a cloud provider, man, you are locked to the company's version. When you're in the cloud, it's like, you know what? I think our group will move forward. And we're not going to wait for those other teams. The disadvantage is everything's a one-off in democratization. So you got 10 teams. They probably did it 12 different ways. I supported a team. One team, we used 4 different languages. And then we deployed stuff in 3 different formats, right? And that some of that won't get fixed, but at least all the teams that are doing, VM deployments will do them the same way. Or maybe they'll get off of VMs and use something else. And the disadvantage also is if with this democratization, everybody does it differently. You don't know the downside of your approach because you're doing it differently than everybody else. And then instead of you building it, you own it, the problem is you end up with is you build it, you left it, and you moved on to something else. And now there's this one-off scary thing in the corner, right? You have a breakdown in visibility and controls. Everything's done differently. The firewalls are done differently. The security is done differently. Access, admin, everything. You have to do a ton of post-deployment scanning and reporting to try and back into what happened. It can be difficult to audit because of that. And you end up with this variable security posture because everybody built it themselves their own way. And that means the security on all of them is different. And so a lot of times it's great to provide a lot of flexibility, but you can kill your cost side and you can also increase your risk, right? Because each project is only as good as the people that were on it at the time it was created. So in response, we ended up creating infrastructure control planes to those problems. We build that proxy that I described on an earlier page. And what are the advantages, right? One-stop shop to find out what you can do. Complex. So when you build something in the cloud, it's not one component, right? You got all these pieces to it. And you got data, persistence, streaming, messaging, whatever else, right? Special search services. And those are hard to do. And if you have a cattle control plane in front of a lot of times, you can glue those things with the access controls and everything together. And you might be able to implement best practices across the enterprise by providing a single place where scaffolding is. I want to do Kubernetes, and it can be kind of hard. And if I create a kind of a usage pattern, then we can just make that happen across the board. It can provide a single pane of glass, blah, blah, blah. Access control lowers the risk in theory. I have seen a company where the entire company was taken out of service because their control plane had a bug in it because they didn't roll it out under their own standards. The disadvantages of the infrastructure control plane, no experimentation environment. It slows down, and I mean because they have constraints. The advantages become the problem, the downside. The greatest strength is your greatest weakness, so that great strength becomes a weakness when you're trying to learn how to do something new or innovate. So innovation tends to be hard. You got to wait until the PROXY tier, this control plane adds the new service or a new feature. Hey, I want this service and I want it to work this way. That service has already been onboarded and it'll be 3 months till we write the wrapper to make it work that way. And there will be all these kind of arbitrary limits because of that, right? Like, hey, we don't support that, or we don't have time to put that in, even though the feature's in the underlying. So not all features in the cloud will be visible. The only other thing I would say is after you put this thing in, there's a bunch of ex post facto control plane activities you have to do, and we can talk about those in another. And the main thing I want to get out of this is, look, building a control plane is amazing, and it's super expensive, but it has certain benefits. But what you got to do is you got to retain a playground for people. The whole point of the cloud is that you can innovate and move quickly, and so you need a place that you can still do that, where people can learn new skills and where they can brainstorm. So I would say that the cloud has really been crazy successful for a lot of people, even though they end up spending a bunch of money around these control plane audit and compliance issues. And that's just the way it is. Have a great day.